Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, I have a very special treat for me. As a long-time listener of what is one of the best podcasts around, Skeptiko, I am very pleased to be speaking to its creator and host, Alex Tsakiris. Alex, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful, Gordon, and thanks for such a nice introduction.
Well, you have been, I'm sure there's a German word for it, like ear friend, but Skeptiko has been my sanity on the commutes into central London these past few years. So you have a quality show, and I'm very pleased to be speaking to you.
Oh, that's awesome that you said, and it was nice kind of meeting you. And I'm kind of really excited to talk to you because I wasn't aware of Rune Soup. You sent me the link. I started listening, and I'm like, wow, this is a cool mix of ideas here. So we ought to have a good conversation.
I think so. I think, funnily enough, before we get into the more classic questions, I have this theory. I'm going to run it past you. But listening to Skeptiko over the years, it is interesting how so many people, it doesn't matter what route they come down, end up in a broadly similar space. Your journey appears to have started, and we'll get into it, with looking at consciousness science. But from there, it's kind of bled into UFO experiences, and it's bled into some analysis of the deep state, because inevitably, if you're doing it right, you start to realize these are all hands on the same elephant.
Absolutely, and I think it's really cool. And that's what I was alluding to earlier is I think it's really awesome that, here's someone who's talking about magic and extended consciousness in that direction, but really kind of in a different way. And then I hear you talking about deep state stuff, and I go, yes, there is that connection. We have to get to the same kind of place.
Well, so I have, obviously, because I'm biased towards a general magical point of view, this elephant that I was just referring to in the metaphor is a magic elephant. I think the worldview that researchers end up on is almost like a non-practicing magic worldview, because you end up with a kind of universe where consciousness is primary, there is some kind of extra-dimensional component, and there is quite clearly a terrestrial component that's worked that out and has decided for its own reasons to make that information non-transparent. And so, funnily enough, I think of a lot of people as non-practicing magicians in a magic universe, because it's like walking out of your house and you find an elephant in the driveway and you're like, oh, I've got an elephant. The magician gets on the elephant and rides it to the shops, and then rides the elephant to his ex-girlfriend's house, and then maybe Venice, that kind of thing. But it's fascinating. I think if you're doing any of these fields right, one of the ways you can tell that is the case is where the alignments are with other researchers in the next field over, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it brings to mind the most recent episode that I heard from you, the astrologer, and now I forget his name.
Austin,
who fantastic. I really loved I love the interview you did. I thought you really did a fabulous job with it, but I love some of the things that Austin said and how you guys connected it. And I thought you made exactly that kind of connection. Austin did specifically in talking about, hey, my path was here and I looked at this, and then I started looking at, power and forces and, magic. And I naturally connected it with what all these people were doing out there in the real world. And I think that's, to be honest, it's a new way to look at things for me, but it instantly has an appeal, and it kind of clicks in and says there's a truth there that I want to explore more of. So again, that's why I genuinely was kind of excited to talk to you, because I want to understand that more, because I haven't gone down that traditional, if there is such a thing, traditional magic kind of path.
Well, that almost brings us neatly back around to question number one. Alex, were you a weird kid?
Not particularly. Felt a weird alienation, but I think from the outside, I didn't seem like a weird kid, but I always did feel really different. Yeah. But I was doing all the regular stuff, and I following around my brother who was 2 years older and trying to do everything he did, and then playing sports and going to school. And I stayed with kind of a pretty traditional path. But yeah, inside, inside I felt kind of weird.
Well, that's fairly common for people who end up where you've ended up. It's that classic Gnostic gospel of the bird has its nest, the fox has its hole, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. It's that kind of realization of I'm a bit different to what's going on.
Yeah, right. Definitely. And, also the other thing that, jumping ahead, I guess, in my story a little bit, and it's funny because I just fully kind of absorbed this and took this in just probably in the last year. But I look back at my life and I was going down a very kind of traditional kind of business path, if you will. So undergraduate degree in business, MBA, job with an accounting firm, consulting, then trying to do my own business and doing all that, and all well and good. Meanwhile, I'm taking correspondence courses from the Self-Realization Fellowship in Encinitas, a few miles from where I now live. I had this interest in yoga that I don't know where exactly it sprung from, but it just grabbed me from the first time that I did it. So all that was I never shared much of that with anyone else. I was just externally just kind of doing this other thing that everyone kind of expected. And then I had this other side where I was like, drawn to this other aspect of myself, this deeper, and now I appreciate bigger aspect of myself. But yeah, that's kind of my story.
Did you make the connection? I mean, I know you just said that was a realization now, but was that where the impetus for kind of beginning the Skeptiko journey came from? Like, was it from that version of Alex?
Not totally consciously. And what I thought was interesting from the beginning, and I don't know how you relate to this, Gordon, but I always felt like kind of an intermediary, a gatekeeper, if you will, between those two. Because one of the things I tried to do with Skeptiko, because it was just where I was at, I wasn't trying to put on performance or anything, but I wanted to take these issues head on, if you will, from a rational, logical kind of point of view, but then approaching that which is beyond logic and rationality and all that stuff. So that was always my personal mission, and it became and has become, the mission of my show.
I like that. My favorite ever line from Terence McKenna is, "If it's real, it can take the pressure." And where I think, going back to the elephant is real. A consciousness-based universe is real, and it can take the pressure, which means there should be, in theory, and this is a very Renaissance magician thing, that's actually what they were trying to do in Florence. In theory, there should be no difference between science done correctly just because we're in a consciousness universe or not. And it's the same thing with operating business and living your life, because these things are occurring within the magical universe. So what really resonated with me straight away with Skeptiko was that, even if it was not expressed at the very beginning, was that kind of same operating hypothesis that, well, science done correctly should find these things because these things are correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I really, I keep saying that. I want to explore that more, and I want to understand that more. So I guess I just need to listen to more and read more Rune Soup, and I'm going to do that. So I don't want to sidetrack this conversation by asking you a million questions. But I will tell you one thing that I also connected with in kind of a weird synchronistic, non-synchronistic way was the whole name Skeptiko, because it was really just, one of these things, a practical, hey, these skeptics seem to be really missing the boat. I'd like to explore that territory. Let's Google the skeptic name and find something that I can get a domain name for, right? And that sent me down this path, and I found this Skeptikos, these Greek philosophers, and pardon me, my ethnic heritage is, half Greek. And so I identified with that. And I said, okay, Skeptikos, take off the S, Skeptiko with a K. There it is. Got it. Okay. So I started doing the show, and 5 years into it, I finally get around to really looking at what these people were saying, what these skeptikos philosophers were saying. And what they were saying is something that has a parallel in the Vedic tradition too. And that's the no, no, no. Not that, not that, not that. I can't say anything for sure, but I can be pretty damn sure that that is not correct. And that's been another real good guidepost for me with Skeptiko, and just personally has kind of served me to say, I may not be able to totally reach out and touch the immenseness of what's behind the veil and what's beyond this ordinary consciousness, but I'm pretty damn sure I'm not a biological robot, in this meaningless. That seems pretty like a flawed system there.
Yeah, it's an embarrassing one. A fascinating story about the origin of Skeptiko there, because I would flat out call that a synchronicity. And my friends and I have been doing some work on kind of unpacking what that word means, because it's sort of a fudge that's become an acceptable way of discussing things that aren't modeled in most people's universes. And interestingly, I know you've done some sort of reading and spoken to guests about things like the remote viewing program. The remote viewers' accuracy improves if sometime in the future they are told whether or not they've hit the target. So it's called feedback. Now, what's interesting about that is you got the feedback 5 years later. So there would have been a curious resonance with the name, and the domain name was there and so on. But that kind of connection is stronger because you eventually found the meaning. My most interesting synchronicities, or the ones that interest me the most, are the ones that come through out of sequence like that.
Well, I think that's a fabulous intuition there, Gordon. And, I just completed an interview, and I haven't published it yet, with a guy named Eric Wargo. Have you ever heard of him? Or?
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's his hunch too. And I think he did a brilliant job in exploring that in Edge Science. Because what you're saying essentially is that, and maybe that's why you say it's kind of a misnomer, is that synchronicity is probably closer tied to a precognitive experience. Is that kind of where you're leading with that?
Absolutely. It's a psi effect. There's no other word for it. It's just it gets watered down because people will go online and find an eye in the triangle behind Rihanna and decide that the Freemasons are doing this week or what have you, and that's not what it actually is. Funnily enough, this is why I think magic and consciousness science are descriptions of the same thing. I actually think magic is a culture-specific description of naturally occurring consciousness phenomena, because if you break them down, there's not that many quote-unquote magical powers. There's seeing the future, so there's clairvoyance, which is a psi effect that is improved by you knowing whether you were correct or not once you actually hit that point in the timeline. There's telepathy, observed for more than a century, as you know, in laboratory settings and just in everyone's damn life. And then there's contact with the spirit world, which is, again, a corollary with things like NDE research. So actually, those are the three main ones. You could go to the Amazon, you can go to a village in North Italy, you can go to the Eurasian plains, and those are sort of the three things that a shaman does. Now, that interests me. That's the kind of, and I think if you get behind what the Renaissance magicians were trying to do, I think it interested them in that level as well.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something, and there's a reality there that needs to be explored in that kind of scientific way that you're talking about. I also am very sensitive to the fact that there's also an elusiveness to it. I'm not comfortable with the whole trickster thing, but because it's so, the way it's literally kind of given to us, I mean, there's some element of that, but I think that plays into this, is that as soon as we start grabbing towards something and trying to nail it down in that scientific way, it does kind of slip through our hands. And back to the Skeptiko, not that, not that, not that. And so in this case, what about the remote viewing where there isn't that feedback loop? What about, the exceptions? And you can go through every case and say, well, what about these interesting exceptions? They would prevent me, I guess, from necessarily embracing that fully as oh, that's a simple psi effect. We're going to learn that in the lab. We're going to understand that, and then we'll be able to build this little machine over here that does that. I suspect that consciousness does manifest itself in these different extended ways that we don't understand, and we can get a greater understanding of them. But I suspect that however great our understanding is, it will still be so freaking minuscule compared to what's really going on there that we got to remain super humble about what we might really be able to do in terms of those realms. What are your thoughts?
No, I think that's an excellent answer. Funnily enough, Pete Carroll, who founded Chaos Magic, said, and I'm paraphrasing, but what's more interesting to him is not that magic works, it's when it doesn't work and why that is, because you can model these things out and go, well, why isn't it? And I know exactly what you mean about the trickster component being much like synchronicity and a necessary but insufficient description. Funnily enough, one of my personal favorite posts that I wrote a couple of years ago was a line from a Skeptiko show when sort of dealing with these extra-dimensional phenomena, teaching algebra to dogs.
Right.
And we're the dogs in that scenario. So you're right, we're never going to get this right. But what I appreciate about Skeptiko is the kind of impassioned mission to... We don't need to get it right, we just need a beachhead. We just need that one bit to say, to be able to point to and go, this has some validity or reality.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it. I think that personally resonates with me. I need a beachhead. I need a way to, I'm swimming in this ocean. I need a beachhead that I can get to and then navigate from there. And that's why on the show, and I keep bringing this back to people, bring people's attention back to the fact of the near-death experience science. And I always point out, look, I've never had a near-death experience. No one I know personally in my family has ever had a near-death experience. But that's like one beachhead for me because we've nailed it down scientifically. There's no brain, and there's still consciousness. That's the bed for me, one of the beachheads, to launch into, okay, there is this extended realm. Consciousness is not connected to this life. Now, boom, from there, where can we go? And it seems to me we can go in all different directions. So I don't think there's anything special about that particular beachhead, except that if we want to approach it from a very scientific, logical, rational kind of way, we can.
Yeah, exactly. Interestingly, you referenced a guest that you have coming up. So I've got someone who's my discussion with them will be out by the time this one comes out, because he's next week. A friend of mine, Chris Bradford, and we were talking about what the prize is, if you will, with magic, and the prize is the reality that life continues after death. It's the same beachhead. It is, and that fundamentally changes the game. It fundamentally changes what you do with your life and how you live it. But it is something that, like, you have a lived personal experience, like an NDE experience set, that will never be able to be taken away or unpicked from you. And that's kind of the first thing you get. And then after that, it's really up to you where you want to go. But it's that same initial prize and that same beachhead.
Right. And, I think there's an interesting point there, because we do have a tendency sometimes to breeze right past that, realizing that the end of your bodily death is not the end of your consciousness, changes everything, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, it changes everything. And it's embedded, like we talked about we touched on at the very beginning. It's embedded in a culture that completely denies that at every turn. And then that culture is embedded in a historical timeline that stands out like a ridiculous sore thumb, right? So throughout time, throughout cultures across the world, no one has believed that this is it, this is the end, this kind of rigid materialism that we believe. Yet we hold on to it like it's just this precious, precious discovery that we've made. And I think, so that's part of the unraveling. So one is the personal unraveling to say, the end of my body is not the end of me. How far does my consciousness extend? The other unraveling is to say, wait, I've been dropped into this culture where, everyone's kind of pretending that isn't so.
And funnily enough, just going back to your point about our culture versus the rest of them, and how this is this materialistic idea that we do actually end is comparatively new. It's a vanishingly minority or vanishingly small opinion even today. If you look at the population of the entire planet, I mean, you're talking about
right.
Western Europe and the US, I think, is between 9 and 11% of the population of the Earth. The rest of them. You go up to an old lady in the Kalahari and say, when you die, that's the end of you. She'll laugh in your face.
Right.
She'll like, what? You're sick. You actually need to go and see the shaman because there's something wrong with you. That's a really naive thing to walk around with in your head.
I totally agree, Gordon. And I think that is the kind of off-ramp loop back to the deep state stuff that we're talking about. So, or we didn't talk about, but I want to make sure we touch on, because again, shows, and I'm happy to get people to listen, because it's awesome, to have a community of people who share something with you. It's just really fun, and it's the part of put out these shows, and I know what shows are going to get 400, 500 shares on Facebook, and I know the shows that are going to get 50 shares on Facebook. Yeah. So when I talk about deep state, everyone just goes away. When I talk about the connections, people just can't get it. So I was excited when I heard you talking about that. So, there is an awesome, loop back, right? So that woman in the Kalahari is caught up in a global system, a global economy that's driven by these guys who are pushing this very narrow materialistic reductionist agenda. And they seek to, and pretty much have, controlled the world. So she doesn't care about that, because she's going to run her cows down and she's going to live her life. But that's because she's gone off the grid by her birthright. For the rest of us who want to join what's going on, we're kind of required to buy into this craziness. And I think we have to look at that from every once in a while. We do have to look at it from a political standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and see what these guys are really pushing, and try and understand why and where all this stuff is heading.
Yeah, not only why they're pushing it, but why over the last 120 years, whenever it gets interesting in a Skeptiko sense, so MK Ultra or, early torsion experiments and so on, why that stuff vanishes into deep black private and we get the Kardashians.
Exactly.
And that's, how you can kind of tell which episodes are going to get the shares and which ones aren't. When I started playing with this, the same thing happened with the sort of magical readership, where I'm like, I have to take this here because this is connected. And funnily enough, by the end of my kind of rambling exegesis about where these parts over the last 100 years, where I think they connect, I'd got a lot more people back on board. But to start with, it was the same kind of tumbleweed reaction. But you have to, I mean, it's a very Alex Tsakiris refrain, but you have to follow the data.
That's what I think. And I think, what's liberated me from the beginning is this idea that my Skeptiko show is my personal journey shared with other people. So I always get a chuckle kind of privately when people say, oh, you should do this or go in this direction, or and that's always to get more viewers. They're making the assumption that I want more viewers / listeners / readers. And I'm like I said before, Gordon, I love the fact that people feel drawn to and want to listen to the show. That's super. But I'm not. really, really resist the idea that I need to do something to get more people to listen. And then the parallel with this, which kind of plays into what we talked about very at the beginning. So that's, philosophically, kind of where I stand in this. But I flip over to kind of the business practical side, and I realize that even if I did want to get more listeners, the best way to do it is just to tell my story and not to try and manufacture some, another phony spin on what's going on, which is what we're just embedded, just inundated with. Every time we turn on the news, it's like, it's not real, so both sides that works for. I just have to be as real as I can be about what interests me, what drives me, and what I see, where I see I need to go next.
Well, so I'm definitely a fellow traveler on that road. I pay for Rune Soup. I pay for its hosting. I don't sell courses. I don't have a Patreon. It's my site and it's my show, and I love having people engage with it and talk about it, and I get new friends and so many new ideas from the people who resonate with it. But it's the same thing. If my background is media strategy, so if I did want a bigger audience, you would know. I'd be like on a billboard in Times Square, and I don't, because that's not what this thing is.
Yeah, it defeats the purpose. You really can't do both. I mean, it would change what you do, and I feel the same way.
That's exactly it. If you try to compromise to go after readers, then pretty soon every show is just a 50-share show rather than a 500-share show, because it's lost the thing that brought people in the first place. I'll certainly stop listening, Alex. So I have this theory, speaking of, you said the business practical perspective. So I have this theory about your kind of iconoclasm, and I'll tell you it, and then you tell me what you think. So most of your guests come from the academic world, which has its own sort of baroque and very silly rules for how disagreement is expressed. But, and this is something I think where we both share, because I can hear it in your voice occasionally when the debates get heated in the shows. If a supplier sells me something that doesn't work, he will fucking hear about it. And he will hear about it until he fixes it. And they're selling us materialism and it doesn't work.
Absolutely. I think the parallels between the practical aspects of business, especially when business reaches more and more more towards the entrepreneurial realm, or like when you're talking in terms of media, which is a very cutthroat kind of business. The ones there are just enormously applicable to that. And the other thing I think it's part of what you're saying is that when you've been in that world and you've learned how to navigate that world, the world of academia is really just it's so easy to navigate, and it's almost silly,
I'm embarrassed for them, or I feel bad for them sometimes, because they don't have that, like, honestly. I mean, I've threatened Adobe with court because I declared that their software was vaporware because it didn't work. Like, I spent $250,000, they installed it, it didn't work. So I'm like, okay, you need to come and fix this, so we're going to court because you've sold me vaporware. And academics aren't used to being spoken to like that. They're not like, hang on, you've sold me some shit. What you just said is shit. You kind of have that medieval deference to someone because of their silly little piece of paper on a wall that they got from the friends who all think like them. And you go, that doesn't fly in the real world. And that, for me, has been what I find so refreshing about how you approach this topic, because it definitely has some of that business Alex acumen to it.
Well, good. I'm glad that came through, because the other part of my background, I actually I had this really push-pull relationship with the business financial part. I really wanted to have money. And the other side is I saw that as a total schemer, end justifies the mean game, and that was really the only way to play that game. That was how I saw it, and I still think that's mostly accurate, not completely accurate. So I was torn between being in that world and being in some other world. And I didn't know what that other world was because I was in my 20s and hadn't been exposed to it. So I imagined that that other world was academia. So I went back to school at the University of Arizona to get a PhD. I was like, great. Get the PhD, especially if you get it in information sciences like I was studying, you get a job. You get a real job. It's a growing field. They need those people to teach all these kids information sciences. You're not going to be some just kind of forgotten dude with sitting on the corner with a PhD in philosophy that doesn't mean anything. You really get a job. So I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. Perfect. I got to check out this world and do that. So I got in there and I did that for a couple of years and got close to doing the dissertation. And I just saw what complete bullshit it really was, and I saw that I was really trading, one set of corrupt, silly rules for another set of corrupt, silly rules. But at least the first set of corrupt, silly rules was pointed towards an end that I knew had the potential to significantly change my life in the way that I wanted to. Well, money fixes a lot of problems. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't.
Yeah. Died in the wool capitalist here. That is so weird. So when I was at university, I had a similar thing. I was approaching, I did a film degree, but it was cultural studies heavy, and we're getting towards the end. And I was quite close with one of the tutors, and she said, and we'd go out drinking, and so she'd complain about her job. And she said, you're quite good at this, you should maybe think about it. And I'm like, it's the same thing. I'm like, if I'm going to play the Game of Thrones, there better be an actual throne at the end of it.
Yeah.
And for me, that was it. If you're going to actually, and I have loads of academic friends now, and they're like, yes, this is some kind of, it's like 20 people fighting over a penny. And I'd much rather the sort of pool of money we're fighting over to be slightly larger than a penny.
Yeah. And at the same time, and this has been kind of one of my missions, is let's not underestimate the influence. And we don't even have to expose those people to how they are being really manipulated and influenced, and how their game is really being played, not by them, but by someone above them. So we can just take the straightforward approach and do like you said, and just call bullshit on what they're doing and say, okay, I'll speak to you in your little language, and we'll talk about controls and peer review and all that stuff, and I'll be polite about it, but I'm going to call bullshit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right as well about the money thing, especially when it comes to consciousness tech and all that kind of stuff. And as it emerged from the Cold War, with the failure and the end of the Cold War, it became quite clear that a lot of money was going into a lot of academic and semi-academic hands to play with some very interesting stuff. And now, wherever that's gone, that money is very rarely available in the public academic sphere, and you kind of see that construction of knowledge based on money by the amount that it costs. I think it costs less than $5 million to pay the top 100 economists for a paper that kind of supports your view in the US each year, which is a rounding error. Give them 150 grand each, and it's a rounding error on the money that a bank makes. So if Goldman Sachs wants to continue down this kind of whatever path it's going down, if it needs academic support, they find the money down the back of a couch. And I wouldn't begrudge someone who, people don't go into academia to get rich. Most of them actually do hopefully go into it to change the world. So 150 grand for an academic is life-changing. Okay. And you end up buying the discourse. And I think one of the solves for it is, rather than to kind of bring it down, is to build a world, which I think you're doing, is to build a world where they don't have where academia doesn't have a monopoly on truth production, but truth production can come from the sort of sound scientific values and analysis, which previously was delivered through the centuries in an academic sphere, because that's how it was transmitted. But in 2016, there are myriad ways that can happen.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of a delivery system that you mentioned. That's kind of a cool idea to throw in there. It also brings to mind this recent interview I had, and I know you heard it, so we can kind of chat about it, between James Corbett, who is an alternative media kind of mainstay, almost, you can say, if that's not a contradiction in terms. But a really great guy and does great work and produces a lot of work. And then Dr. Alexander Wendt from Ohio State University in talking about the one world state. And so we had kind of a good go around about that. But, one of the points that Corbett made was, he just couldn't get past how an academic might think about this. And he was so caught up in kind of the practical, he was so caught up in the delivery system that is totally fake that he couldn't see, and this is an abstract point here, but I know you'll get it, so we're having this good private conversation. That's what these are for, so we don't have to talk to a general audience. But so he's going on and on about, James Corbett is like, you're crazy, this world state is just going to be bad, no matter how it's spun, no matter what the idea of it is. And my only counter to that was, James, I look at, and everyone in the world sees these, even though they're directed to the United States, but the United States Navy commercials, and there's this beautiful expanse of blue ocean, and then you see this cruise, this aircraft carrier ship, and you hear the rumbling, and the music is perfectly panned in there. It says, "A force for good." If you're at all tuned into what's really going on, you go, "A force for freaking good." Oh my God. It's just the opposite of all that. But the flip side of it is, hey man, that's our best chance. Our best chance is that, as speaking from an American standpoint, is that we still believe we're a force for good. We believe that there is a good and that we should do that good, because then ultimately it comes back around when the shenanigans, they're a lot worse than shenanigans, but I'll downplay it, are exposed, and we get rid of those people if we can in whatever way we can. We have a forced or a guidepost to go towards. And the way I relate that back, Gordon, is that's what I think you're saying about the delivery system of academics. So it can be all screwed up, and it is. It can be completely corrupted and co-opted and bought off, like it is in science and in medicine and in every field you can go down, archaeology, every one of them, right? But the original concept of the delivery system is still intact. So I think by us paying respect to it, we're really calling on its higher, better self than it really is, because that is the path forward for it to really stand up and be what it was meant to be. And that's what I hear in what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. There are things that I don't want to do that I want academics to do. I don't want to go out into Syria or Turkey and dig around in the dirt to find little potsherds. It doesn't super interest me. So as a structure for knowledge production, and I mean that extends into genetics, that extends into the meta-analysis of consciousness research. Like, I want to see the results, and I'm fascinated, and I want them to be part of the discourse. But I don't want to do them. So there's still like that return to its higher form, the sort of Platonic ideal of academia. I think you're right. You kind of need to hold it in your head and want it to be there. But you can only do that if you're aware of its shortcomings. The same with, a political system. But I agree completely. Like, it would be, we have the choice to kind of decide, even if they don't come true, which world we kind of want to point our ship in the direction of, and that one seems much better than all of this is crap.
I agree.
The James Corbett stuff got interesting. I appreciate he's got that very alternative media belief that everything is some kind of slow and elaborate drip game towards a one world government, which I don't think at a super elite level they need. They have it. I mean, it's governments are fulfillment mechanisms for the kind of extremely rich people at the very top, and if anything, it's just a bureaucratic hassle and additional cost. So and that was what was interesting, because you could kind of see that in what Alex was saying. what was his name, wasn't it? Alex?
Yes.
Yeah.
Went.
Dr. Wendt.
Alexander Went.
Dr. Wendt. You could see what he was saying. It was almost dispassionate because he actually went to pains of saying, I'm not saying this is good. I'm saying it's happening. And he did have the force of numbers. Yeah. So if this appears to be how complex organisms structure, then we need to look at it so that we don't end up with a one world government, and we do end up with some sort of decentralized, participatory way of kind of running the world with one voice rather than have one voice run the world.
Right.
And I think that, and I get completely why, because it's inarguable that a one world government would be a nightmare, but I don't think that's happening, and I think it diminishes some of the really interesting stuff that Dr. Wendt kind of thought about. It's definitely one of those sort of shower thoughts that we went from 600,000 political systems to now under 190 in what is an eye blink in the evolution of mankind. So really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to getting ourselves to a single government or a single governance system, and just to say it's bad is sort of like saying the waves are bad or gravity is bad. I'm like, well, there's probably something else on like a genuine cosmic sense going on there. And I think you kind of be King Canute sitting there in the tides trying to stop it.
And I think you also touched on a really interesting point, though, that I don't think we need to blow past too quickly. And that's that even that is not the real game. Right. So as you were alluding to, it's a necessary bureaucratic game that has to be played one way or another. And that the real power and influence, while some of it is embedded in that bureaucratic system, it seems to us over and over again as we really look at it that the majority of that power is outside of that system. And that until we get that perspective, we're kind of fighting the wrong war. We're fighting the wrong battle.
Absolutely. The persistent challenge, well, it's my observation that the persistent challenge with that in alternative media is the well-funded ones, mentioning no names, are probably CIA COINTEL. And otherwise you have the desperately underfunded ones who, bless them, have had noble careers of trying to expose this information. But as a result, they've never been around rich people and have no idea how they think and see the world. So the analysis you get is quite childlike. And in my career, I've been occasionally useful to some reasonably rich and powerful people. So I know how they see the world, and they couldn't tell you who the prime minister is. It's irrelevant to them. It's not even evil. It's just, well, it's not great that it's
there's
systems,
a certain realism to it.
Yeah.
There's just a certain realism to it. Yeah. It's like you mentioned, Gordon, you quite correctly about the cost of completely changing scientific opinion by these publishing papers, right? So we can quantify that easily. Move that over to the political spectrum. And anyone who doesn't understand that needs to go down to the local political arena, like I've had a little bit of exposure to just in terms of being an investor in some land transactions. You want to go get the support of a senator, not a United States senator, but your local senator, how the system works here in the United States. It's in the state level, it's, oh wow, that's a big thing. In the grand scheme of things, it's pretty not a high civil servant kind of thing, not that big of a deal. How much does it cost to get a personal meeting with that person? It's costed a few $1,000s. I mean, so what does it cost? Even when they throw the money around, the figures around that the big influencers, quote unquote, have in the charade that is the current United States presidential election. Oh, that person donated $1 million. Pardon me, but back to your point, $1 million, like you said, this is chump change. It's, couch change kind of thing. So if you extrapolate that out and say, how much influence could you buy for $1 billion? It just boggles the mind. And I think that relates exactly to your point. I mean, we don't know what's really going on.
And did you envision that at the outset of the podcast that these things would dovetail, because it does end up, I mean, you butt your head up against the sort of materialist op. I mean, you can call it that in academia. It is a concerted plan to, one, keep their jobs, and two, push a very specific worldview, or provide the scientific backing for a very specific worldview. The academics aren't trying to take over the world, but the kind of technocratic reordering of the planet kind of needs these things as evidence. And I don't suspect too many academics actually realize that, but that's what they're there for. But was that the process for you to go from, all right, I'm going to look at consciousness science at the tipping point, and then, a couple of years in, it's like, well, wait a minute, this has genuine geopolitical implications?
I didn't know. I was naive, and that's why I feel, a real affinity to Skeptiko and my audience, because we've walked this path together. I've learned this from them and from the people I've talked to and experienced it. But no, I didn't. I mean, how about you? I mean, did you go into, how did this realization come for you, or did you always have that sense?
No, not at all. I mean, I grew up in regional Australia, so it's a fairly uncorrupt place to live. I mean, you have the kind of silly little local politics things of some property developer paying chump change to someone in the local council, and that's the talk of the town. But it's a generally nice place to live. And then I moved to New Zealand, which is literally the least corrupt country on earth. In that corruption index, it actually beat Sweden, I think, last year, because it's always number 2 or so, but now it's number 1. So I actually spent 7 years in the least corrupt country on earth, working for a national newspaper as a young kid. So obviously I knew everything, conspiracies, all this, that's nonsense. I was way too smart for all of that. I worked at a newspaper.
Right.
And it was moving to London, whatever that is now, 8 years ago, that I realized, and it was because we showed up just as Lehman Brothers collapsed. So I actually had a job interview with a company one day when we first arrived, who the night before, I subsequently read in the newspaper, the CEO actually rang the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying, if you don't fix this, I can't pay my workforce of 80,000 people tomorrow. And I'm just sitting there in HR the next morning going, this is what I know how to do. So it became quite clear to me. I mean, London's very good at that kind of club shadow state sort of game. And it became...
They invented it, man.
Yeah, pretty much. So it became clear to me straight away that what you see in what you are expected to believe does not match reality. And so I kind of had a disastrous financial incident that made me think, hang on, there are things, the difference between reality and what we're expected to believe is quite extreme. And so that piece sort of stuck in my head. The magic stuff came long before that. It's been kind of how I see the world since I was about 13. But those pieces sort of went together, and some sort of magical experiences or dream state experiences led me to look again at sort of UFO stuff. And then those 3 pieces kind of lined up, because if you have an IQ over 100, you quickly realize that the UFO phenomena aren't very well described as little green men in flying saucers. And funnily enough, I'm reading through it going, I actually have a language to describe or interpret a lot of the stuff that's going on here, because I've just gone through, 19, 20 years of magic. And so those are how the pieces connected for me, because it does, again, if you're following the right breadcrumbs, most people, the ufologists didn't expect to find consciousness science. The magicians didn't expect to find UFOs. But especially when you're talking about the last 120 years, you can't avoid having these discussions.
Again, I don't want to turn this into me interviewing you, but I am interested really, really intensely in that last point that you just made. How do we explain the fact that the magicians weren't expecting to find the UFOs?
So the UFO description of the phenomena is a singularly 20th century, more or less, a singularly 20th century description of these phenomena. Much of the words we got for it, we got from, say, 19th century science fiction, but a sizable chunk has come from what is essentially Cold War propaganda. The magicians didn't see it because they were using words from 500 years ago. So you have the angel of Mars and the intelligence of Mars, and you essentially have, this is kind of going back to the discussion I had with Austin, you essentially have you have names for these things already. So the discussion goes in that way, which means if you were to have an experience that someone, having watched, I don't know, Ancient Aliens or a bunch of Discovery Channel shows, would today in America consider a UFO experience, that is interpreted in a very different way because, because these phenomena have persisted. This is what my book, which comes out next week, is about. These phenomena have quite clearly persisted since as far back as we can see in the human journey, and are in some enigmatic way involved in the human journey. So essentially the magicians were using words that were a couple hundred years out of date, and I was the last few, well, actually it was a couple of years ago now, but I'm trying to push them together to say, when you talk about this stuff, we're talking about the same range of phenomena, not the exact same thing. It doesn't mean the spirit of Mars is an actual little green man, because we're not, it's the beachhead thing again. We're not actually at the stage where we can do taxonomy, where we can say this is this and this is this. We just need that kind of first principle agreement that we're probably talking about the same range of phenomena. And I think in the last few years, magic, at least the good magicians, or the competent ones, thinking along those lines.
That's a reasonable explanation. It just never feels quite complete to me that the language angle, and I get that. If we were to see a technology today that is that far ahead of where we're at, we'd probably describe it in a really weird way. I get all that. It's just hard to really personally kind of take that in and say, oh yeah, that explains it. So they saw that craft, that nuts and bolts craft, because I do think there is a nuts and bolts aspect to it, whatever that means, however that manifests itself. And we see it in the Renaissance paintings, if we accept that. We see it in some very ancient archaeology, if we accept that, but then so that they had some encounters with some things with physical reality, and yet they kind of interpreted it. Or for the other possibility, I guess, is that their deeper, more accurate interpretation of it is lost to us, just as, our history is kind of filtered down and is so,
Yeah, that's certainly, that last bit is certainly a factor. I should probably put some more context around it. I agree completely. I'm a big fan of Dr. Jacques Vallée, and he uses the word Magonia because of the story that Bishop Agabad in Lyon was told that actual ships filled with wizards came down from the sky and landed, and actually the villagers caught one and kept it for a couple of days. So I don't for a second want to suggest that there isn't a physical phenomena to it. I was more referring to the fact that those incidents are sporadic and dramatic. So if you look at, say, the Fatima miracle or whatever happened in Lyon during the sort of time that Bishop Agabad was getting about, those are not necessarily what I'm referring to. I'm referring to sort of, I was listening to Grant Cameron, who does some good research but quite naive analysis. And he's been doing a lot of work with experiences, and he says 41% of them that he's interviewed have experienced quote-unquote downloads, so it'll be like a novel or mathematical information or that kind of thing. And that is more what I was referring to when, if you look in the grimoires, funnily enough, there's a couple of them that are fascinating because, they kind of have an introduction that's a bit of a just so story, like it's not real. But one of them has to do with a monk who goes up a hill he can kind of hear the devil in his cell. And so he goes up the hill to start talking to this sort of local devil. And it's like the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because the description is like the clouds come over and there are lights in the clouds and this music, and they're kind of shouting up at it. And you go, well, so that event didn't happen because that guy isn't real. That's the kind of how grimoires are written. That bit is fake. But he's describing something that I've seen in a movie, and then the rest of the book is essentially a guide to how you communicate across that divide between the human and the spirit world. And that's the bit that I think is the continuity. If you look at the majority of, dare I say, credible UFO accounts over the last 100 years, and I consider the experiences to be credible rather than the sort of shaky videos on YouTube that's not really very valuable information. But much like the NDE thing, nobody's going to get rich by saying that they've had some sort of persistent UFO encounter. So you can kind of you sort of fairly quickly sound out the scam artists. And then there's the other ones who've had this encounter or string of encounters. And that's the continuity, I believe, with the Western magical tradition, because that effectively describes how early modern witches or even the Renaissance magicians would work. They had a kind of a spirit team of familiars and beings. And what interests me is how many of them relate to the stars. And I think in the 21st century, we need to have the discussion of which pieces of these descriptions correlate.
I'm with you, and I think that's fascinating. I'm really interested, but I'm also doubtful that I'll ever be able to really understand the relationship in that extended consciousness realm, because that's where you immediately go, right? I mean, it exactly follows the path of this conversation that we've had. So you get your beachhead and you stay on your beachhead because your beachhead's good, but you realize your beachhead is total bullshit. I mean, your beachhead is just your convenient way of kind of dealing with life. You realize that everything is really way, way beyond the beachhead and beyond the ocean. So when you start dabbling in there and you see, okay, this spirit realm, and there's this ancestral spirit realm. So my parents are there, my great parents are there, but then there's something way beyond that. And then there's some kind of connection between these other beings that pop in and out of there, they be demonic beings or angelic beings or extraterrestrial beings. And where do they really fit in this? I didn't want to say hierarchy because that assumes too much, So how do they relate? And then we have these magicians, and how do they relate? And those are really the questions we want to answer. And to an extent, I think that information is not available to us because it's not supposed to be available to us, because maybe in a lot of ways it's not that important in the grander scheme of things. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing out some ideas there.
Well, there's kind of one big question, which is the sort of after death or God question. So in theory, if the kind of God hypothesis or what have you holds, then nothing else is important. That's the one thing. Magic pretends that it's some sort of wisdom quest, but it's tinkering. And as a result, it's certainly not for everyone, and it's kind of like a garage activity. You're not taking your car anywhere. You're tinkering with the car. So I'm under no illusions that this is that a framework for scalable analysis comes out of these discussions, because it doesn't. But it's inveterate tinkering. It's like being a writer or something. You just can't. It's just how you're built. You kind of want to have a play with these things. And yeah, it's so. What your observation is reasonably accurate. To be fair, that it's not really. But from a magical discourse point of view, one of the things I would like to accomplish with my show, for instance, is to have that interdisciplinary conversation within magic, within the kind of general world. It's not a. Not conclusions, but the kind of talking points that we agree on as a result of that aren't going to be hugely valuable to anyone else.
Well, no, I think it is hugely valuable to someone, and I think it's really liberating when we can say it is a garage activity. I love that phrase. That's awesome. I mean, because that's all any of us are doing is a garage activity, And the unimportant thing, I don't want to offend anyone, and I'm glad you didn't take it that way, but the term is fresh for me because somebody posted it on the Skeptiko forum recently in relating this amazing. It was a woman who related the amazing account of her husband, who is now deceased, but had these series of near-death experiences. And, so we've all heard all these stories and stuff like that. But that was the phrase that came out, and it really resonated not only with me, but with a couple of people on the forum, is that he just said, what he was told in that other realm was, all that stuff that you think, it's just not that important. It's unimportant. And he was like, no, my son died in a, suicide, and my other, well, that's not really important, and it just kind of puts it all in perspective, I think.
No, absolutely. And you could, I attribute more accuracy or validity to spirit or NDE encounters that are prosaic like that, because again, it's kind of true. One, I'm not that good at it, but it's matched some of my earlier experiences when I decided I was going to be able to, don't judge me on this, but I decided I was going to be able to communicate with guides and do all that kind of crap I was apparently interested in as an early 20-year-old.
Absolutely, yeah.
But dealing with people who are quite good at that kind of clairvoyant stuff. I know you've had some success and some quite good ones, frankly, on the show when it comes to people with skills in after-death communication. When you get the prosaic answers, that's usually it. So I don't know if you... she's dead now, but Sylvia Browne wrote a bunch of books, and she was a reasonably popular or reasonably prominent sort of TV psychic.
Right.
And I saw her a couple of times when she came to Australia growing up, and she would have that same thing where she'd ask her sort of spirits a question, and they'll be like, "Oh, it'll be all right." And they're like, "That doesn't really help me right now." And she's like, "Yeah, it's fine."
Yeah, right.
And if the model holds, again, from the other side, it will be fine. You'll be here in a couple of minutes. And so trying to get it's one of the things I love about Jacques Vallée is he writes things like, just because a message comes from heaven doesn't mean it's not stupid. And you get that because we are kind of dealing with however reality is constructed, it is constructed in a way such that communication, quote unquote, between the realms is difficult and unreliable. As to why that's the case, we can speculate and have speculated probably for tens of thousands of years on that, but it is the case. And so it's the garage tinkering. You can kind of play with the fact that that is indeed the case, but don't take too many of those statements to the bank.
Exactly. And I love the way you put that too. What people remind me of that I think is always brings me back is that no matter what you would describe there in terms of the communication or it being stupid or whatever, it's all a part of consciousness. And even though we can't say that with, certainty that, we understand, conscious, or we have this complete non-dual thing figured out, screw all that. Even at the basic, simplest level that we understand, anything that we would describe is part of that whole. So, it can't be. The stupidness has to be part of the whole. The evil has to be part of the whole. Everything we could describe has to be part of the whole. It can't be outside of it.
I absolutely agree. And there's somewhere on the edge of stupidness and evil where we get back to the dreaded T word of the trickster, which is, and I will credit the idealists with this. They're actually very good at it. Have you had Dr. Bernardo Kastrup on your show yet?
A couple times. He's kind of a good friend.
Yeah, he's awesome. So, he makes the excellent point that the only thing we can know is consciousness, so that by definition, even if you're operating scientific equipment, this stuff is happening within a consciousness field. And so, absolutely, I agree, which means that kind of range of events where they go from kind of stupid to evil to tricksterish is an aspect of the wider study of that kind of consciousness field.
You can't get away from it.
No, and you can prove that with logic, and I find that fascinating. The show's definitely ongoing, long may it continue. Is that the prize? Is that the best thing you think you've learned so far on the Skeptiko journey?
Ah, boy, that's a tough one. I mean, I think one of the big prizes is to realize that you're just in the garage tinkering and that that's okay,
Yeah.
and to do the best job you can with the tinkering is okay as well. And that's maybe what I think is the prize. It's okay. It's okay. And you're doing, just continue to do good work, and that's all you need to do.
That's a good answer. I like that. It's that's a good answer. Why did you go down the podcast route? Is this how you process information well, do you think, in a kind of conversational sense?
I think so. And I was always just drawn to listening to, I think most people who are into podcasting can relate to this, is to listening to these folks who I liked and admired, or was at least interested in their ideas, and kind of screaming out to them, like, what are you talking about? I had the questions, I just didn't have a way to ask them, and podcasting provided that. So you put it into a format that is acceptable and maybe useful to other people, and then you get to talk to all these cool, interesting people and see what's up.
Well, you're doing yeoman's work tinkering in your garage, because, as I said, I listen to it on the commute, and when it gets to a particularly good bit, I know that within fairly short order, the transcript comes up, so I can actually go and find the information, which is amazing. I mean, is that... I don't know how much time you devote to this.
Well, I hire those out. Somebody does Nikki does the transcripts for me, and she's done a really good job. I've kind of shifted to doing excerpts, which I think kind of works really better. I wind up transcribing about half of the show, and that seems to work for people because then you just get the parts that are there. But I love the people who listen to the show because, it's back to, again, Gordon, we have so many kind of touch points that we can kind of relate to. Is I do have a practical business side that says, okay, you have this content, you want to deliver it in the way that you do want your content to be used, to be heard. So, I've found that a lot of people like to do that drive-by, like to read. That doesn't mean that they may not listen to some shows, but they want to quickly scan and see if they're interested in, and the transcript really helps a lot. That's the other shift I made is, I kind of copied the I shifted my podcast around and kind of copied the Upworthy model of sharability, that it's really about that sharing has surpassed searching as a way of people getting content. So I've tried to make the content on the website more shareable and kind of moved in that direction. So those are kind of the inside baseball kind of practical things I've done.
And do you think you're a pioneer species? Do you think we're just on the tip of a podcasting golden age after a certain show last year that got very popular that shall remain nameless?
Definitely. I mean, I think the long tail thing is just awesome. I think the fact golden age. For me, I don't know, and you didn't. I'd love to hear your point too, but for me, it's awesome. There's so many. I mean, now I have another show. I have Rune Soup. I don't know how I'm going to listen to it. I already have a backlog, like we all do, on the iPod to listen to all this stuff. But you can find out information on anything through this form, and some of it is just so good. Your show is really good. People contact me all the time, not all the time, but I hear from podcasters, and you listen to the show and you kind of cringe a little bit. You go, okay, that's where you're at and stuff like that. And I listen to your show, and you're just really good. You're really smooth, and you're asking really good questions. I'm getting really good information. I just downloaded this for free, and I get to listen to this. This is great.
Yeah, I feel like I've just walked out of the jungle into the city when the the podcatcher app on the phone downloads before I go to work, and I look at these things, and it's in I guess in information theory you have kind of a cutoff point by age. So my parents will use Facebook, but they won't use Twitter. And I'll use Twitter, but I cannot understand Snapchat. It terrifies the crap out of me. And and so you kind of can, and I know the age, like honestly, the average age for Facebook around the world is about 43 now. It's like it's heading up to newspaper levels because kids use it as their LinkedIn. Like they have an account and they don't use it. For me, I think, other than Snapchat, I think where the quote unquote the internet or the digital revolution makes me feel like I've just walked out of the jungle is with podcasting. It's when I can look at my phone and download intelligent conversations with people that I've sort of followed or have been intellectually interested in their output, and that's what I'm listening to on the bus. That's amazing, and so I'm with you with the golden age thing.
Yeah, it is a golden age. It's cool, and it's so fun to learn. It just is fun. It's fun to learn. It's fun to know all these things, even these things that really tear apart our world in some ways that don't feel real comfortable. If you get into conspiracies or if you just you're changing beliefs. I've done a bunch of shows on religion that a lot of people find really offensive, and I don't mean them to be necessarily, but I don't care if they are either. But that can be very unsettling for people.
No, sure. They wouldn't listen if there wasn't that risk. Again, you can't sort of dilute the mission. But on that note, actually, as we're kind of coming up on the time we have, which has just flown by, I mean, I've mentioned the name of your show 50, 60 times in the last hour and a bit. But Alex, where might people find you?
Skeptiko.com. So Skepti, and then you have to do Ko on the end because that's the Greek spelling.
And the fora or the forum is where most of the activity is?
Not really, but there's a certain, crowd. I mean, folks who are listening to our conversation would probably feel really comfortable there because it's kind of more of an inside baseball kind of thing. And I go there. I love going there. I love the forum. So I go there all the time, and people want to talk to me. That's the place to do it.
Nice one. And obviously find it in iTunes and Podcatcher, Skeptiko. I'm fairly sure there's a reasonable crossover, but hopefully we'll bring more people to the party.
Absolutely, and so then, and I do, we should think. I want to have you on Skeptiko to do one of these movie things that I've started to do, which is really fun. I have an idea for a movie, but we'll have to exchange on email. But what I'd like to do is pick a movie that people might not necessarily think that you and I would pick, and then find the deeper connections to kind of some of the stuff that we talk about.
All right, that is an awesome place for me to hit stop so that people are like, oh, what are they going to be talking about? So I'm going to do that. So once again, Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. It was great having this conversation with you.
So as you can probably tell, I was fanboying pretty hard there. Alex has a great show, which is always good brain food. So for me personally, this conversation was a long time coming, and I certainly hope to have him back. I'm quietly confident a goodly chunk of you are already regular listeners of Skeptiko, but if you're not, then you have an absolutely fascinating back catalogue to keep you entertained and informed for a long time. As for this show, let me know your thoughts about some of Alex and my topic areas, the role of after-death communication, the status of academic research, and or the potential correlation between modern UFO phenomena and historic accounts of spirit contact. And as ever, if you liked what you heard, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. Thanks to everyone who's been reviewing the show on iTunes, by the way. I really appreciate it. If you want to get in touch, drop me a note on the blog at runesoup.com, the Facebook page, also called Rune Soup, or on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.